Yeah.
Okay. Jai Bhim to one and all. On the beautiful evening, I, Shubhangi Sunita Pravesh Khandare, is pleased to welcome each and everyone of you to a brainstorming webinar on the topic Dalit Thoughts and Anti-Caste Movement in Late Colonial Tamilnadu. We want to express our heartfelt thanks to Association for Social and Economic Equality for organizing this webinar. It gives me a pleasure to share with you all that today's our 79th webinar under the guidance of Honorable Padamshree Sukhadeo Thorat sir and his energetic efforts. Sir?
Yeah, please. Thank you, Shubhangi. Again, I welcome today's honorable guest, Dr. V.Geetha, Dr. Sukhadeo Thorat, Dr. Vimal Thorat. Many important persons join today's seminar. That is the Prashant Dalimkar, Dr. Pushpa Thorat, Shura Darapuri, Niladhar Hadke, Ranju Anitya, and so many. I welcome to all of you. On behalf of Association of Social and Economical Equality, I welcome to all our respectable delegates to today's webinar. The topic of the today's webinar is closely relevant and will get we more insight of the history of Dalit movement and present relevance in Tamil Nadu. Today, we are going to share the views on our learned speaker on anti-caste movement in Tamil Nadu. She is having a defining experience. Dr. Geetha Madam ji, our target audience is mostly academicians from colleges of university. Just we have completed the 78 webinar on different relevant topics closely to public. I will quote few topics for your convenience. Are the present policies of Dalit enough and relevant? Achyutananda and Sant Ravidas, anti-caste and untouchability movement. Maharaja Sayajirao Gaikwad, annihilation and untouchability. Caste stratification among Indian Muslims. Scheduled caste Sikh and issue of social exclusions. Struggle of Dalit and Dalit Christian against the caste etc. And last webinar, 78th webinar was pre-independent and anti-Andhra movement, anti-Andhra, anti-caste movement by Dr. Melapalli Lakshmaiah. This is the 79th webinar, and we welcome strongly to you, madam. Madam is having very long experience, and Shubhangi, I am handing over to you, please.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Today's webinar is chaired by Honorable Padamshree Sukhadeo Thorat sir, former chairman of UGC and ICSSR, New Delhi, and president of Association for Social and Economic Equality. I warmly welcome you, sir. On today's occasion, we are blessed to have a guest speaker, Honorable Dr.V.Geetha ma'am, feminist, historian, writer, and translator editorial director, Tara Books, Chennai. On the behalf of association, I cordially welcome to you, ma'am. The person who have consistently existing for organizing the webinar, Honorable Professor Vimal Thorat, ma'am, I heartily welcome to you. Now I would like to invite Akshay Gujral sir, student of Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai, for introducing today's speaker. Akshay Gujral sir.
Welcome, ma'am. So now, V.Geetha ma'am is a feminist historian, writer, and translator.
Akshay, your sound is breaking. Akshay, your sound is breaking.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, but breaking. Please.
Okay, just wait. Am I audible now?
Yeah. Please carry on.
Sorry for the interruption. So now I'm introducing V.Geetha ma'am. V.Geetha ma'am is a feminist historian, writer, and translator. She writes in Tamil and English on caste, gender, labor, and education. Her published work in English includes Bhimrao Ambedkar and the questions of socialism in India. Second, undoing impunity, speech after sexual violence, and towards a non-Brahmin millionaire from higher caste to Pariah. She is currently editorial director at Tara Books, Chennai. I strongly welcome you, ma'am, on this platform, and we would like to hear you more. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Geetha ma'am to deliver her discourse on the topic Dalit Thoughts and Anti-Caste Movement in Late Colonial Tamilnadu. Please welcome to ma'am.
Thank you very much, Shubhangi and Dr. Hajare and Dr. Gujar, and to Professor Thorat, and whom I haven't seen in a while, but whom I've had the pleasure to know over the last 2 decades and more. Jai Bhim to all. So what I would like to do in today's webinar is to take you through a journey of the old Madras presidency and point out the more important moments of Dalit assertion and the kinds of ideas and debates that unfolded in the late 19th century and well into the early 20th century. I would like to focus explicitly on the writings of Pandit Ayotitas. But before I come to Ayotitas, I'd like to sort of have a broader map of Dalit thought as it evolved in late colonial Madras. So one of the things that we all know that has changed the way we look at the colonial period is the growing body of literature on anti-caste struggles and movements. Initially, this literature addressed colonial Bombay and colonial Madras, but today we find that there are a number of studies which engage with late colonial India across the subcontinent. So you have Dr. Rawat writing about the United Provinces. You have studies of caste and anti-caste movements in Kerala. You also have very, very interesting debates around the Adi Andhra movements and the anti-caste movements in both Telangana and in Andhra Pradesh. Likewise, there's been writing on the caste question in Odisha, in Bengal, where the caste question was not considered germane until fairly recently. So what this literature has shown us is that when we think of the colonial period, most of us think of it through 2 lenses normally. One is the nationalist lens, that there was this nationalist struggle against colonialism, and the nationalist struggle had to do with colonial exploitation, foreign rule, and it was focused on Swaraj, eventually leading to Indian independence. Then there was the other struggle, the struggles of peasants, of agricultural workers, of Adivasis, of factory workers. And these struggles are usually seen under the broad rubric of left-inspired struggles or socialist struggles. And there's been a very long history of the socialist critique of nationalism, that it was actually not a nationalism that addressed internal class differences, that it was bourgeois nationalism. And there's been a lot of writing about both its possibilities and its limits. And we all know that a critique of bourgeois nationalism from a subaltern perspective was put forth by historians from the 1980s onwards. But more recently, in view of the growing literature on anti-caste movements, it's evident that there is another perspective that we need to bring to the late colonial period, and that is the perspective offered by anti-caste and anti-Brahmanical movements. And I think this literature is very rich, and what it points to is, why did sections of the Bahujan and Dalit communities think that British rule was preferable to what they considered as Brahmin rule? How did they understand the colonial period? How did they work with its contradictions? And what did they have to say about the future of what today we call India? And I think this literature is very fascinating. It exists in many languages, Hindi, Punjabi, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Marathi, Odia, Bangla, Malayalam. And I think what this literature tells us is the anti-caste movements had some features in common, but they also were sufficiently different from each other. And that difference had to do with the geographies in which they emerged. Because I think each part of India while the caste system and untouchability were prevalent everywhere, in each part it was accented in a different way. It existed in a particular kind of way, and the movements that emerged in different parts of the subcontinent both answered to local realities, but also kept the larger question of caste and untouchability in focus. So you had different ways of engaging with the caste and untouchability questions. And even within the same region, say what you might call Western India or Southern India, or even the Madras presidency, there were differences in emphasis, differences in demands, and certainly differences in their visions for the future. So what I have to say today really pertains to the Tamil-speaking regions of the old Madras presidency. Because the Madras presidency included sections of Malabar, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh, and a little bit of Odisha. So my presentation is really confined to the Tamil-speaking regions of old Madras. And I think even within the Tamil-speaking regions, the response of Dalits to the colonial situation was not uniform. It was fairly diverse. And that diversity had to do with where different Dalit communities were located, whether in rural Tamil Nadu or in Mofussil Tamil Nadu or in urban Tamil Nadu, whether they were part of the coastal economy, whether they were part of the plantation economy, or whether they were part of the peasant economy. So depending on these differences, they also put forth different kinds of demands. What they had in common was, of course, three things. One, they welcomed colonial rule as signifying a break in what they considered the rule of the Brahmins and other upper castes in India. They felt that colonial rule had opened up the world of education to them, that it had made for occupational mobility. They were not anymore confined to, say, the peasant economy or to caste-based labor, but they could actually move about and make choices, even if those choices did not sometimes appear to bring them a great deal of ease or comfort. But the fact of mobility was considered very, very important. The third thing was the gifts of Western education, not simply what was learned in the classroom, but that because of many factors, the spread of print culture, the public debates that happened because of the missionary critique of the caste system, the Christian missionary critique of the caste system, certain kinds of laws that were made in British India. So all of these were felt to have opened up spaces for Dalits and other lower castes to ask some questions about their own societies and to also think of the future in very interesting terms. So while Dalit communities across the Tamil-speaking regions of Madras organized in different ways and formed diverse associations and had different kinds of demands, they all also shared a set of historical assumptions about where they were in late colonial India. And this is interesting because on the one hand, we know from the economic history of late colonial India that this was a difficult time. This was a time of famine and hunger. This was a time of migration, and the migrants did not always find prosperity wherever they went. This period from the late 1870s until almost the early 20th century, until the end of World War I, saw a lot of people dying of hunger, dying on account of not being able to access healthcare, and so on. But yet, this was also the period when you have an eruption of Dalit intellectual life. And so how do we understand this contradiction? I think one of the ways in which we can understand it is that the conditions that made for a disruption of social and economic life also created new conditions which some Bahujan and Dalit communities could use to their advantage, and from within that space offer a critique of Hindu caste society, of Hinduism, and also make a case for equality, justice, and fraternity. So this is what we might want to call the productive contradictions of colonial rule. And out of these productive contradictions, a generation of Dalit intellectuals sought to create a new body of knowledge and thought. And this body of knowledge and thought goes back a long way, goes back actually to almost back to the late 18th century in some ways and the early 19th century, but it finds its fullest expression from the 1870s onwards. So this is a broad historical picture within which I would like to place my the rest of my presentation. So one of the earliest petitions that Dalits put out in public, and these are called the Pariah Petitions. The Pariahs, as you know, are one of the large Dalit communities in Tamil Nadu. These Pariah Petitions were created in the late 18th century, and basically they addressed the government of the city of Madras, not the entire presidency as such, but the city of Madras. And what's interesting about these petitions is that they point to two things. That the Pariahs have rendered immense service to the East India Company and to the British government by actually working in all the settlements that the British had made their own. And when they face a certain kind of injustice, they expect the government to come to their aid. So what you find is this very interesting equation being made between the labor they perform for the East India Company and its government and what they expect in return for that labor. So basically this petition was made out in the context of a land dispute in Chennai city, in Madras city at that time. Land assigned to the Dalits had been encroached upon by people of other communities and they wanted the land back. So this was one of the earliest of the petitions that was made in the Madras context. And you see already a new idea being formulated, a connection between labor and political rights. And this is important because, as you know, labor and caste society is often stigmatized, especially labor performed by Dalits. It's not seen as holding value. It is in fact seen as something the Dalits ought to be doing on account of their birth and what that birth allows them to do. So here was a new kind of argument that my labor has to be valued because I have done this work for your benefit, for your well-being, and therefore you ought to serve justice. And I think what's interesting is that the petitioners see the East India Company as capable of delivering fair justice. Now, in the past, too, Dalits had perhaps approached kings, approached large caste communities with their claims for justice. But this claim is new because they assume that there is a ruler who will not abide by the rules of caste, and that this ruler will offer justice on fair and equal terms. Now, the East India Company, of course, did not always do that. As Baba Sahib Ambedkar would say, the British ruled India in terms of fulfilling their own interests. And whatever laws they made were in that context. So one cannot really see the British as being beneficial rulers who actually understood the sufferings of Dalits. Ambedkar always distinguished between modern forms of governance from colonial forms of governance. He felt that modernity held promise, not necessarily colonial rule. So likewise, the Pariah petitioners of 18th century Madras felt that here was a new government, here was a new principle of governance, and perhaps they might be served well by this government. So this is one of the earliest kinds of, if you're thinking of thought, a new kind of idea is being defined in these petitions. So that's one moment in that history which is interesting. Then the second moment is, of course, as you know, just as in the Bombay Presidency, the East India Company's armies had large Dalit regiments. Just like you had the Maha Regiment in Maharashtra, there were sepoys who belonged to the so-called untouchable communities. And on account of being in the British Indian Army, they also stood to gain in terms of somewhat regular employment and access to education. This is something we all know today. And one of the things that a Dalit historian has recorded, Professor Sundarraj Manikam, who's no more, who actually remembers his grandfather being part of the British Indian Army. And one of the recruiting slogans of the East India Company's army was, and this is also something that's quoted in Radhika Singha's book on the coolies under the Raj, that the recruiting slogan was, if you wear the king emperor's uniform, you could walk into the Brahmin's quarter and spit and no one will actually punish you. So it was basically a kind of incentive for the Dalits to join the army by saying that if you join the army, the kind of caste restrictions that you have to face with are likely to be reduced, that you will not be seen only as a caste being. And this is something that a later day Dalit leader and scholar, M.C. Raja, would actually reiterate when he made a submission to the Indian Central Committee, which was reviewing reforms for British India, that one of the things that Dalits have gained by being in government, not that they've been able to influence policies to a great extent, not that they are present in large numbers, but in every other trade they can be thwarted. If you're a merchant, if you're even a teacher in a private institution, you could always be marginalized. But when you're part of government, it's not so easy to do that. And the space of government allows Dalits to actually think of matters other than their own immediate self-respect and their own immediate well-being. So from the time of those who were in the army service to those who later would be nominated to the legislatures in the 1900s, there is this line of thought which views being part of government as freeing you relatively from the stigma of untouchability. Now, whether that happened in all cases, whether everybody in government could actually exercise their role and their responsibilities without being stigmatized is a different matter. As we know, even from various Dalit autobiographies, that was not always the case. But I think for Dalits, it was important to actually be present in governance structures so that they could actually then, as Baba Sahib Ambedkar would say later on, be present where the terms of associational life are being set, where the terms of political association are being defined. So I think being part of government has been a very important and long-standing tradition and argument. And the right to be in government is something that generations of Dalit political leaders and intellectuals would define and redefine in different ways. So that's also something that you see emerging from the early 19th century, but it's also a line of thought that's pursued into the 20th century. So that's another important moment. A third moment, I think, is the moment of conversion. Now, as you know, that Christian conversion was a fairly consistent and it addressed subaltern communities in southern India, perhaps much more than elsewhere. And there has been this phenomenon of what today is called mass conversion. Entire communities converting to Christianity. One of the earliest mass conversion movements was in the 17th century when an entire community of fisher men and women converted to Catholicism. But the great mass conversions of the 19th century were different because these were conversions that were largely undertaken by large Dalit societies in different parts of Tamil Nadu. And there were many reasons for these conversions. We won't have time to go into those reasons fully. But one thing was that there was the possibility of access to education and being part of a religion where scripture did not discriminate against you. And one of the things that you find from Dalit Christian testimonial writing from that time is that how Dalits understood a very central Christian ritual, which is the Eucharist, where after Mass, the priest goes around sharing the blood and body of Christ with everybody. And to actually be part of the body of God, so to speak, was seen as extremely revolutionary. And you can understand why that is so, because as you know, in the Purusha Sukta, it is God himself or the Purusha who decides where you fit into the social hierarchy. Those who are born from the head are the Brahmins. You know that, all of us know that very well. So the divine body is where caste differences are actually substantialized. So you have a religious tradition where the body and blood of God are equally available to everybody, and and where you are part of that reality. And that actually made a huge emotional and existential difference to at least a certain generation of Dalit Christians. This is not to say that caste disappeared once you converted, certainly not. Caste continued in many forms within the Christian church, but equally there was a protest against caste as well, which also continued. And caste did not, and being part of the church didn't automatically mean that poverty was diminished or that, caste-based labor went away. So Rupa Vishwanath, in her very interesting book, The Poor Pariah, points out how the missionaries would criticize caste from a social and religious point of view. But when it came to the material reality of caste, which in rural India had to do with who had land and who didn't have land, they didn't often stand or could not afford to stand with their converts. And the British government used the missionary critique of Hinduism to call attention to the religious basis of caste, but did very little to fight against the economic basis of caste. Now, that's one kind of development that we have. But for Dalits who converted, being part of the Christian community, it also meant a kind of emotional and psychological freedom. And I think that is something that we need to also take seriously in terms of how Dalits thought about their lives in the 19th century. So that's another important moment. And equally important, I think, are the missionary forays into education, the schools that were set up and which opened up education for not only Dalits, but for the so-called lower Bahujan communities as well. Communities such as the Nadars, for example, who were deemed near untouchable in the 19th century and whose lives were transformed on account of being part of missionary communities and also part of colonial trade transactions. So I think that idea that there are religions where I am not stigmatized in a scriptural sense, what Baba Sahib Ambedkar talks of as sanctified inequality, where inequality is sacralized. That's his critique of Hinduism, that it sacralizes inequality. So there are religions that don't sacralize inequality, and it was important for at least some Dalit converts that Christianity transformed their inner lives. While there is a critique of what Christian conversion did to Dalits, that's one part of the story. Equally, another part of the story is that many Dalits experienced conversion as a transformative moment. And that's also a part of the history of the new kinds of ideas that Dalits were coming into and expressing and talking about. Then being part of Christian schools had its own consequences. You could actually get into education. And you were also Dalit girls and young Dalit boys who were taken into the so-called industrial schools. Now, these industrial schools were something that fitted you for a certain vocation. You could be a carpenter, you could be a welder, you could be a technical person. And for women, it meant you learned embroidery, you became a teacher, you became a nurse. It didn't, of course, give you that kind of a fulsome humanistic education that Baba Sahib wanted for all Dalits. You will recall from the Mahat Satyagraha speech that he says, I don't want you to become only welders and technicians. I want you to have an education that will make you take hold of the society and actually set the terms of its rule. So he had this broad-based humanistic education in mind and not just vocational training. But whatever vocational training that was there in these industrial schools created communities of certain kinds of workmen and workwomen who then went on to better their lives through that kind of labor. So you have the first generation of young nurses from Dalit Bahujan communities. Also, don't forget, the upper caste did not come into nursing until much later because they didn't want to touch the bodies of those whom they deemed were lower in the caste order. So the earliest nurses and attendants in hospitals, especially missionary hospitals, were from the lower caste, and some of them were Dalits. And this, of course, was an interesting development because what this also meant was that Dalits were now seen as part of the field of modern medicine. And that was an interesting development. And what that actually meant was that you could not actually put away with their services or stigmatize them when they were performing these very important life-saving services. And in fact, one of the things that you find happening in old Madras is there is a there is an attempt to actually work against missionary conversion as far back as the 1870s and 1880s. So you have something called the Hindu Tract Society and the Vibhuti Sangam, associations which worked against conversion. And one of the things that they used in their propaganda was precisely this medical education, when they said, if a person converts and calls herself Esther or calls himself Samuel and then works in a hospital, don't we respect them? Why can't we extend the same respect to our fellow Dalits otherwise? Because if we don't do that, they'll convert to Christianity. So there was this whole medical history was used by groups of liberal, perhaps well-meaning Hindus to prevent conversion. So that's also an interesting development. So this was a new kind of a new possibility that opened up, that made for a new kind of self, which was taken note of by the caste Hindus. So that's another thing that you'll see. But perhaps from the point of view of intellectual life, what was most definitive was the emergence of print, the expansion of print, the expansion of publishing from the mid-19th century onwards. Now, many reasons why this happened. Now, one of the things that you see almost immediately is from, say, the 1860s, you have a continuous tradition of Dalits becoming journalists. So one of the earliest attempts at Dalits in journalism might be traced back to the 1850s. And today we know all of this because of the amazing work put in by young Dalit scholars since the 1980s, who've looked at various aspects of Dalit life in colonial India, and who also have brought to the fore a tradition of autonomous Dalit intellectual life, autonomous Dalit political activism, autonomous Dalit social activism. And I think this is very important because scholars such as J. Balasubramaniam, who's done this really interesting book on Dalit journalism, Stalin Rajangam, who's written on Dalit Buddhist communities and the different kinds of Dalit organizations that have emerged by the late 19th century, and work that has been done and that continues to be done today around the lives of Dalit women who are active in public life, like Meenambal Sivaraj. N. Sivaraj, as you know, was in the Scheduled Caste Federation. So there's an entire generation of young Dalit activists and scholars who have brought together a history that continues to be written as we speak about autonomous Dalit political presence, autonomous Dalit intellectual activity. And it is because of their work that we now know that Dalit journalism has a long history, that it goes back as far back as 1855 in some cases. Though we don't know the details of all these journals, in some cases we only know their names. The 1855 journal, for example, perhaps had a Dalit Christian editor or someone writing for it continuously, but we don't have any further details. And so you have a number of Dalit journals that continue to be published from the mid-19th century well into the 20th century. And I think what this Dalit journalism secured for Dalits was it created a space for them to put forth their demands. And as I said, these demands were not all of one kind. So if you had a journal that was published from the city of Madras, obviously it would focus on things to do with urban life. Though it did publish things from elsewhere as well. I mean, it carried notices about what was happening to Dalits elsewhere in the old Madras region, and also what was happening to Dalits elsewhere in British India, right? So, for example, Pandit Ayodhitasa's Tamilan, which was one of the most fascinating Dalit journals to have been published, carried notices about Dalit communities across the Indian subcontinent. So you have references to the work done by Sayaji Gaikwad for Dalit education. You have references to the Maharaja of Kolhapur, Shahu Maharaj. So there was also this looking out for what was happening to Dalits elsewhere. You also had these journals calling attention to particular grievances, looking at what was happening elsewhere, and also offering a critique and commentary on political developments, offering their own perspective on political developments. And that's also very interesting. And I just want to touch on a couple of things, two journals that were very interesting. One was published by Rettamalai Srinivasan, R. Srinivasan, who accompanied Baba Sahib Ambedkar to the first roundtable conference. And both of them together put out this very important memorandum on Dalit rights. And I think we should perhaps revisit some of those documents, because when we write the history of the Indian Constitution, we usually begin with the Karachi resolutions of 1931. But actually the first, I think the most important constitutional document is a memorandum put out by Srinivasan and Ambedkar in the first roundtable conference, because that is where you first see a demand for untouchability to be declared illegal. And also there's also a demand for constitutional safeguards and the writing of the constitution in such a way that the state is made liable for acts of violence against Dalits that go unpunished. Now, all these are things we will only incorporate into the PCR Act many years later, in 1955 and later on in 1989. But this early constitutional document actually anticipates all that, and R. Srinivasan and Baba Saheb together authored that document. Well, R. Srinivasan has a long, interesting career behind him. He started the Pariah Mahajana Sabha in Old Madras, Pariahs being one of the largest Dalit communities, and they started a journal called Pariah. And this journal actually was one of the first journals to bring together the opinions of educated Dalits on a variety of issues, including to do with government policy, to do with issues to do with employment, migration, and on burning political issues of the day. So that is a very important journal that didn't continue after a while, because Srinivasan left to go to London to press the claims of the Dalits with the British government. But on the way, he spent some time in Africa and spent the next 15 years in Southern Africa doing a variety of tasks. And at that time got acquainted with Mahatma Gandhi as well, and so on. That's a long story. But the interesting thing is that the Pariah goes back to the late 19th century, and that then becomes a very important, shall we say, civil society kind of a space, a journalistic space for Dalits to put forth their rights and claims. So that's a very important magazine. Another very interesting magazine, which was published a few years later, and of which we know now quite a bit because of J. Balasubramanian's work, which is also sort of cited by others, including Rupa Vishwanath. There was a journal published from Nagapattinam, which is a coastal city in Tamil Nadu, and which in British India was a very important port. Many of those who migrated to Ceylon or Burma or the Malay Straits left from Nagapattinam, not from Chennai so much. They left from Chennai as well, but Nagapattinam was an important port. And Dalits, educated Dalits in that part of the old Madras presidency, started a magazine called Vahikattuvoon, or Guide. It meant guide. And very, very interesting. Apparently, we don't have access to many copies of the magazine today. But from what they were saying and doing, and Vahikattuvoon was a magazine that represented an association called the South Indian Depressed Classes Union that was founded. And it seems to have spoken up for the laboring classes of that region, but with a strong anti-caste focus, which is a very interesting thing. And one of the things that they appear to have pointed out is that Dalits must have access to land. Now, this is something all Dalit organizations call attention to. The Dalits must have access to public land, whether it's grazing land, whether it is water, such as a pond where you can fish, whether it is forest land. So Dalits must have access to land. Dalits must have their own homesteads. And Vahikattuvoon also talks about the importance of what is owed to Dalit labor. So it points to the many means by which Dalits are persuaded to migrate and asks for transformations in the indentured labor situation. There are also references to how, because Dalits are not often literate, how they are cheated of their rights, and that therefore, should Dalits be embroiled in legal cases, there must be a government-appointed committee with Dalit members that assist them. This is extremely interesting and advanced thinking in terms of how Dalits sought to put forth their rights and claims. So what you have then in Dalit journalism is this sort of coming to grips with all the changes that were happening in British India and trying to look at those changes from the point of view of Dalits laborers, from the point of view of Dalits who wanted political rights, in short, from the point of view of the most marginal sections of the population. So that's what Dalit journalism does. And that's a very important space from within which very interesting arguments are made about Dalit political equality, Dalit social equality, and so on. Another important development, and I'll end with this before I come to Ayotitas, is that, as you know, the late 19th century was also a time of migration. People migrated in search of work. And many of them found work in the coffee and tea plantations, rubber plantations, and so on. The earliest migrations was to the sugar plantations of Africa, Southern Africa. Now, what's interesting is Dalits who migrated suffered a great deal, no question. But those who managed to survive and educate themselves and acquired some extra cash came back home and acquired land for themselves. Equally, they also came back and set up schools, founded societies for the progress of Dalits. And that was a very important development because many of them later on would become part of various anti-caste movements in the Madras presidency. Whether they joined Periyar's movement or subsequently Babasaheb Ambedkar's SCF, these were all people who had acquired political maturity and political the growth had actually grown their political ideas in their diasporic spaces. And there are some fascinating stories here. I won't have time to go into all of them, but I think what's important for us to note is that migration opened up the world of Dalit laborers and made them think in a broad global sense as well. So, for example, those who migrated to Ceylon started a magazine of their own called Adi Dravidan. And from that magazine, you get a sense of how they were interested in a wide variety of things. So they were not only speaking in terms of what was owed to Dalits, but they were also speaking in terms of what they wanted by way of equality and justice for everybody. So you had a kind of a universal language of rights that Dalits were beginning to articulate from within these spaces. And one of the most interesting stories is about a Dalit man who migrated to South Africa. He never came back, but he's very, very interesting. His name is Bernard Sigamani. And there he became active in what was a very well-known global and very radical trade union called the International Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. Subsequently, he was part of the anti-race, anti-apartheid movements, but he also created conditions for Indians across caste to come and work together and protest together. So his was a very, very interesting life. Now, whether he had connections with the activists here, we don't know. But basically what the space of the labor diaspora did for Dalits is it opened up a world of ideas and possibilities. And you will also recall that those who came back and founded the Adhar movement in Punjab, many of them had migrated as well. Manguram had come back after being part of the Ghadar movement in the United States. So I think there's an entirely interesting, rich history of ideas here that we need to connect and understand. What did migration do for Dalits? We know the tragic side of that story, but equally there was a productive and another side to the story of which we don't know too much, but which today Dalit historians and researchers are putting together for us. So I think that's another important thing. Now, all these developments that happened found a focus in the writings of Ayotitas. And I think that's why he's very, very important and very, very interesting. And Ayotitas is interesting for several reasons. What I want to do today is to point to how he read and understood these different changes that had taken place in Dalit life, which I had sort of, just pointed to until now. So Ayotitas is interesting also because he belonged to a community of Dalits, and there were several such communities. And in fact, Babasaheb refers to them in his Mahat Satyagraha, where he says that people tell us that Dalits are not educated, but I know of several Dalit homes that have manuscripts, that have access to these old texts. So likewise, in the Tamil context, you have communities of Dalits who've had a tradition of autonomous Tamil learning, either associated with medicine or with astrology or with both. And you also have a tradition of what you might call Dalit sannyasis, bairagis basically, who would sort of declare themselves as adherents of Advaita, the monastic philosophy of Shankara, which they reinterpreted in very interesting ways. They used Advaitic monism to make a claim for equality, especially in the modern period. So you had many modern sannyasis who used the language of Advaita, but you equally used the language of modern equality. And these sannyasis were very active from the late 19th century and well into the 20th century. And you know that there were such sannyasis who went on to be part of Dalit movements elsewhere in India as well. So you have Bhikkhu Bodhanand in the United Provinces, who was part of the Adi Hindu movement and worked along with Achyutananda. So you had these sannyasis, and some of them had access to traditional Tamil learning. So Ayotitas was part of that long-standing tradition of Dalits who had access to learning. And who are these sannyasis? What were they? So you have this tradition of people renouncing samskara, right? Renouncing life, so to speak. And renunciation put you outside caste society to some extent. And from that position, these Dalit Advaitins offered a critique of caste society. And in Tamil Nadu, you also have the tradition of the Siddhars, these critiques of caste who did not heed orthodox Vaishnavism or orthodox Shaivism, and who spoke a language of transgressing caste norms. So these Dalit sannyasis of the late 19th century and the early 20th century perhaps can be seen in the context of these long traditions of protest. And recently, I'm sad to say he is no more, but a very interesting Dalit scholar, Ramakrishnan, who's actually worked on a tradition of urban Dalit music called Ghana. Some of you might have heard Ghana in Paranjit cinema, in and through Paranjit cinema and the music of the Casteless Collective. Ramakrishnan also has done some very interesting research on the presence of these Dalit Advaitin sannyasis in the city of Madras itself in the early 20th century. So you have this tradition of Dalit renunciants who offered a critique of caste. And in the modern period, they combined the language of monism or Advaita along with the secular language of universal human rights, and made for some very interesting kinds of ideas. Anyway, to come back to Ayotitas, he belonged to that long tradition of learning, which some pursued from the point of view of becoming a sannyasi. Ayotitas himself was not a sannyasi, but he had access to Tamil texts. And these texts, as you know, were available in the form of palm leaf manuscripts. And people had access to different traditions of palm leaf manuscripts. And Ayotitas was part of the tradition of Siddha medicine, which is pursued until this day in Tamil Nadu. And he was a well-known Siddha doctor in the city of Madras. He was originally from the Nilgiris, but he moved to the city of Madras. And as you know, he was one of the earliest of converts to Buddhism. He did not consider it a conversion. He felt he was returning to the original faith of the Dalits, and he converted in 1898. And he, along with P. Lakshmi Narasu, whom Ambedkar valued a lot, whose book, The Essence of Hinduism, he considered a very important text. So Lakshmi Narasu and Ayotitas together founded the South Indian Buddhist Association, or the Sakya Bauddha Sangam. All of this happens up in the early 20th century. But Ayotitas is not simply someone who brought in a very new understanding of Buddhism into Tamil Nadu. He did many other things. So let me just quickly take you through all that he did. One is he, like many Dalits of his time, welcomed colonial rule, felt that it had helped Dalits negotiate a better place for themselves. But he also disagreed with the colonial understanding of Indian history. So he offers a full-fledged critique of what you will call British Orientalism. He doesn't call it Orientalism, but he basically says these British writers on Hinduism, they went by what their Brahmin informants told them, and they assumed that there is such a thing called Hinduism. But actually, there's been no Hinduism till they put everything together and said, these are Hindu texts. And he offers a critique of Max Muller. So while he welcomes the British governance systems, British law, British education, he feels that their understanding of Hinduism is not quite correct, and that there is no such thing as Hinduism until the British put it together. So what you had are many traditions of worship, and he thinks that these many traditions of worship are corruptions of one original tradition, which is the Buddhist tradition. But I'll come to explaining that later. So he has this very interesting contradictory attitude to British rule. That's one thing, like many of the other Dalits of his time. Secondly, he also thinks that while British education and British learning opened up the worldviews of Dalits, allowed them to access a secular language of equality and justice, Dalits themselves possessed a tradition from which they could draw inspiration. And this tradition he would call the Purva Bauddha tradition. That this is that we had been Buddhists in the past. If we know that tradition well, we will know that we have a history where we live together in a spirit of equality, fraternity, and justice. So you don't have to only look up to the modern context, but if you can actually understand that you were the original Buddhists, that if you actually had created this wonderful civilization, you wouldn't only think that modernity is from where you have to get your ideas. But very interestingly, he was not opposed to modernity as well. So he basically welcomed Western science. He felt that there was a congruence between Buddhist philosophy and Western science. And this is something that Lakshmi Narasimha also argued. And in fact, this was an argument that was present across the Buddhist world, in Ceylon, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, that Buddhism is something that is not unlike Western science. So there were attempts to align Buddhist philosophy to Western science, and Ayodhya also does that. He says, just as how I, as a doctor, when I examine a patient, I find out what's wrong with him through examining him or her, and then I come up with a diagnosis, and then I prescribe medicines, and then I follow up. And that's what science does. It looks at evidence, it comes up with an argument, then it offers a prescriptive theory of how reality is. And my tradition is old, and my tradition owes a lot to Buddhism, to Buddha himself, because the first doctor was Amitabha Buddha himself. So he connects up traditions of local learning to the Buddha being a healer. So in that sense, he felt that Western learning and Buddhist philosophy were closely interconnected. So that's also very, very interesting. Though Ayodhya does a lot of thinking in terms of philosophy and medicine and science and so on, he was also a very practical and political person as well. So he followed what was happening in his own time. And he was a very keen observer of all the changes that had happened in British India. So for example, when he talks about how, when people say British policies have ruined Indian agriculture, he also points out it's not simply British policies, but who stands to gain from British policies? It's Indian landlords, it's caste Hindu merchants. So why are we leaving them out? If they had a sense of justice, if they had a sense of, fraternity, the poor won't suffer. So he also brings in the dominant communities who benefited from British rule to point to how you can't simply blame the British alone. And then when it comes to, say, labor conditions, he says, yes, of course, Dalits are migrating, and maybe they're not migrating always to better places. But then why shouldn't they leave their homes? What is there for them that is so attractive that they shouldn't migrate? Because life is fairly miserable if you're in bondage. Life is fairly miserable if you don't have a trade of your own. So migration at least opens up possibilities for you. So he took some very interesting positions on what was happening in his own time and place. And while he welcomed new forms of learning, while he didn't think that missionary activity was wrong or bad, he felt that missionary conversion was problematic. Because while he admired Jesus Christ, while he admired Christian scripture, he felt that Dalits ought not to convert. Instead, they should go back to their original faith, which is Buddhism. So he had this very interesting double-edged relationship to Christianity. Unlike the Hindus who viewed the Christian missionaries as their rivals, Ayodhya had a far more sympathetic understanding of Christianity and Jesus. But at the same time, he felt that Dalits need not convert at all if they have to feel a sense of self-respect and equality. All they have to do is to remember that they are Buddhists. And how do they remember that they are Buddhists? And that I'll come to again in the last part of my talk. So that's something that he looked at. But I think one of the most interesting things that Ayotitas does is that he was one of the earliest Dalit critiques of nationalism, of Indian nationalism. So we all know that there was this moderate extremist split in the Surat Congress, right? We all know that history. And and you had this whole emergence of Swadeshi and Swaraj, Tilak and Lala Lajpat Rai and Bipin Chandrapal, and we know that story very well. And in the Tamil context, Ayotitas offered a contemporary critique of what he termed Swadeshi social reform. Basically, he said this whole call for everyone to unite in the name of a single nation, that will work if we are not divided amongst ourselves already. But we are a hierarchical society, we are a caste divided society. Every day we observe caste differences. We practice untouchability. We don't accept that all Indians are equal. So what is this nationalism all about? How can we be a nation when we have hierarchy, we have social and economic injustice? In column after column, using everyday examples, he pointed out how those who insist that we are one nation are those who want to preserve their upper caste, religious, and cultural identity and make it seem as if this is our national identity. He also said that you can become a nation only when you become one people. And you become one people only if you give up caste. So he felt that you had to work to become one people before you could become one nation. So that was a very interesting critique that he offered. He was also in touch with local leaders of the Indian National Congress, and he criticized their moves. He said, whatever you proclaim and say and do does not really take the condition of the most poor and the most marginal into account, that your plans don't have anything for them, and so on. So he offered a very strong secular critique of Indian nationalism. So what we find Ayotitas doing is, on the one hand, he's very alert and alive to what's happening in the present, and like a lot of other Dalits were doing, like the editors of Varikatuan were doing, like MC Raja would do, like LC Guruswami would do, like MC Jagannathan would do. These were all Dalit representatives in the legislature, the colonial legislature. He's as concerned with discrimination. He's as interested in Dalit education. He wants government to do more for Dalits. He wants better laws. All of this is extremely central to how he understands the present. But equally, he's very interested in mobilizing Dalits in a religious, spiritual sense as well, religious, cultural sense as well. And this is where his whole Buddhist perspective becomes very important. So while he takes Diksha in 1898, he goes to Sri Lanka, at that time called Ceylon, and takes Diksha. He comes to the Theosophical Society with a claim that we might be called untouchables today, we might be considered a stigmatized social group, but actually we were all once Buddhists. So we want to return to our original faith. That's how he comes to the Theosophical Society. And that's when Colonel Olcott of the Theosophical Society has a dialogue with him and then goes with him to Ceylon, where he converts to Buddhism along with some others. So what is Ayotitas's understanding of Buddhism? And I think this is very, very interesting. And here he's quite different from these other Dalit sannyasins whom I spoke of earlier. He's also quite different from Dalit secularists who didn't quite want to get out of Hinduism, though they criticized Hinduism. So people like MC Raja, even Ratnamalai Srinivasan, all of them were very critical of Hinduism. They were very critical of what today we would call Brahmanical Hinduism. But they felt that Dalits were actually the oldest Hindu community, that they were Adi Hindus in some ways. And later on, when Baba Saheb announced in Yola that he would not die a Hindu, many of these Dalit leaders dissociated themselves from that statement. So in that sense, there were not many people who actually made a case for Dalits being Buddhists at one point in time. So Ayotitas was making a rather original claim, if you like. Now, the only reference to the possibility that Dalits could have been Jains or Buddhists is there in a stray missionary remark sometime in the 1840s. And later on in your own Maharashtra, you'll have Vittal Rao Shinde writing a piece saying that Dalits were possibly once Buddhists. And then you have Haraprasad Shastri in Bengal saying that the most marginal communities in Bengal perhaps were once Buddhists. But these are all very isolated claims. What Ayodhya Das does is, he not only claims that Dalits are Buddhists, but he also goes on to provide a full-fledged argument as to why this is right, why it is right to think so, and why Dalits must come back to Buddhism. And he does this in many ways, 3 ways. I'll just take you through those before I end. One is, he looks at life around him. And as we know, in any peasant context or in any social context in India, our everyday lives revolve around a number of community rituals. And many of these community rituals, at least in southern India, have to do with the worship of mother goddesses. We all know that. Perhaps in Maharashtra as well. So Ayodhya Das looks at these various forms of worship that exist, not just rituals specific to particular regions, but broader rituals, which are shared by across regions, like say Diwali, for example, or temple festivals, which bear resemblances to each other. And he looks into the core beliefs of each of these rituals and ceremonies, and he then goes on to deconstruct them. And he says that each of these rituals has a Buddhist origin, right? And that Buddhist origin, he puts it down to a very rational kind of occurrence. So, for example, in Tamil Nadu, in the month of Ashada, your Ashada and our Adi, there is this tradition of worshipping the mother goddess. And so he says, why do you worship the mother goddess, and who is this mother goddess? And he makes a case that she was actually a very wise bhikkhuni who had access to healing traditions and who was worshipped and commended for that purpose. And later on, she becomes incorporated into a pantheon of local gods and goddesses, and then assimilated into the broad Hindu pantheon. And she says that originally she was worshipped not because she killed some Ashura, but because she was a healer. So for every such festival that he picks up, he offers a reason as to why that festival or ceremony came into place. And the reasons he gives are all mostly rational reasons. So basically what he does is, he offers a modern ethnographic reading of these festivals from a Buddhist perspective. And this is a Buddhist perspective he himself develops. So this is on the one hand. Second, what he does is, he is also in touch with the kind of Buddhist, let's say, renaissance that is happening all around in South and Southeast Asia, where there's an attempt, as I said earlier, to align Buddhism to the study of science, to also make broad connections between different Buddhist spaces, right? Burma, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and so on. And this was done to the work of the Mahabodhi Society at that time. But over time, the Mahabodhi Society got taken over by caste Hindus. And as you know, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee himself was the one of the presidents of the Mahabodhi Society. So Ayodhya Das and others did not think the Mahabodhi Society represented the true spirit of what they understood to be a world Buddhist civilization, right? So he wanted to reinterpret Buddhism as a world religion. And therefore, he wrote this amazing text running into about 300 and odd pages called Adi Vedam. Adi Veda. And this text is fascinating. At one level, it is based on the Buddha Charita, which Ambedkar also uses to write Buddha and his Dhamma. But it also uses the Pali text, and Ayodhya Das knew Pali. It also uses the Pali text, the Tripitaka that we are all familiar with. And he constructs this amazing life history of the Buddha. And what's interesting about the Adi Veda is there are 3 kinds of metaphors that he uses. One is, of course, the core story of Siddhartha and how Siddhartha becomes a Buddha. It's a familiar story. We all know it. It's not the story Baba Sahib uses in Buddha and his Dhamma, but the more familiar story of him seeing those 4 sides and then becoming a convert and all of that. And then going out and then, renunciation and all of that. But when he talks about how the Buddha puts away desire, he uses the language of Siddha medicine. So basically he's saying it is also about being spiritually and physically well, and how desire is something that comes out of greed. And greed is a bad thing. Greed pits human beings against each other. And then he offers what today's doctors or psychologists would call a psychosomatic reading of desire, what it does to your mind, what it does to your psychology. So he brings in the language of Siddha medicine in very interesting ways. Another thing he does is he brings in the history of world religions, whether it is Judaism, Christianity, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, but not, he doesn't use the word Hindu, that's very important. Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Judaism, Christianity. And he says, whether it's Moses who created the 10 commandments, or Yeshu who has the Sermon on the Mount, or Krishna who is this Vaishnavite, God, or Shiva, all of them are really many forms of the Buddha. And the teachings of all these various traditions were already present in the Buddha's teachings. So he assimilates world religions to Buddhism. It's quite an amazing hermeneutic move that he does. So Moses becomes part of Buddhism, Christ becomes part of Buddhism, Krishna becomes part of Buddhism. Everyone is a Buddhist. Everyone is a form of the Buddha. So the Adivaisam is a fascinating text. That's a second kind of thing that he does. And the third thing he does is he interprets the idea of Maitri, which is a very central tenet for Baba Saheb as well, because I think Baba Saheb says very importantly that greater than Karuna is Maitri, because it is not simply equality and fellowship between human beings, but with the whole of creation, which is a very broad, expansive understanding of fraternity. So the word that Ayotitas uses for Maitri in Tamil, which is also a Sanskrit word, is Jiva Karunya. And Jiva Karunya can be narrowly interpreted as Ahimsa, but he doesn't mean Ahimsa. He means Maitri in the sense Baba Saheb would later use it. So this Jiva Karunya, he then uses to anchor equality. He says, if you have to be in a spirit of sympathy with all living beings, you have to consider all of them equal. And it's not simply human beings, it's also plants and animals. So today we talk a lot about the age of the Anthropocene, right? We say we have put human beings in the center of the universe. But Ayotitas therefore makes a case for an economy where you don't have to kill and overexploit nature to survive, where you can actually work with the riches of nature and practice a life of restraint, and everybody will have everything. So it's quite a remarkable thing that he does. So he is against meat eating, he is against an overexploitation of the natural environment. He thinks that labor has to be valued and respected. He refuses to accept this division of, Brahmin, Shudra, Vaishya, and Kshatriya. He says that whoever labors on the land must be considered valuable, and as a farmer, whoever labors on the sea must be considered valuable, and as a fisher. So he has this great thing of the laborer as a fountainhead of knowledge. And his sorrow is that you don't take that knowledge seriously. So he contrasts the knowledge of the laborers with what he calls the really useless knowledge of the Brahmins. And that's a very interesting contrast that he builds up. Anyway, out of all of this, he then produces a history, which he calls the history of the Indirar Desam. And he says Buddha is actually Indra. Why? Because he has controlled the Aindriyams, the 5 senses. And therefore he's acquired the name Indra. And this was a land of the Buddha. This was a Buddhist civilization, which the Vaishya Brahmanas conquered through guile, violence, and cunning. And this narrative is familiar. Phule also uses it in some ways when he talks about the destruction of the king of Bali, right? So he uses that narrative and he says the original good Brahmanas were the Buddhists. They are the Yathartha Brahmanas. Then you have these Vaishya Brahmanas who came and then conquered everything. And they destroyed Buddhist civilization, not simply through violence, but by putting in place an entire system of lies and untruths. And what are these lies and untruths? They are the Puranas, they are the Itihasas, they are these various customs, these various beliefs that we follow today. And they are overlaid on the original Buddhist ceremonies and the original Buddhist ideas. So he says, you have 2 realities, a reality that is there outside you, and you think that's real. But there's actually an inner core, which we have to understand is the original Buddhist core. You have to recover that. So that's his idea of what he means when he says, go back to being Buddhist, right? So is to recover the Buddhist core of civilization. And I think that's a very fascinating argument. And and to read it in Tamil is very interesting because he brings many, many different kinds of thought worlds into that text, into Adi Vedam. So this is Ayodhya's for you. And to me, he sort of brings together many of the developments that took place in colonial India, gives it a certain kind of intellectual and let's say religious and spiritual coherence. But of course, there are some issues in what Ayodhya has to say, not in terms of questioning his historical understanding. That's easy to do. But I think he also was part of his time in some way. So while he says this was originally a Buddhist civilization and Dalits were the original Buddhists, he says not all Dalits were original Buddhists. Those who were original Buddhists are of one kind. Then there are those who have remained low because they have not risen high. And so he separates Dalit communities into those who were subordinated by the Brahmins and those who are subordinate because they haven't got better. So somewhere he also then sort of ends up affirming this hierarchical logic. But that's a kind of a minor intrusion in his writings. He doesn't build a theory out of it. That somewhere when you work with this whole hierarchy of caste, unless you completely place yourself outside it, it enters your thought world in different ways. And Ayodhya places himself outside it in a fulsome way most of the time. But in a couple of places, he divides Dalits into those who can be Buddhists and those who have to be worked upon before they can become Buddhists. So there is that tension in his thought. I just wanted to point that out. I don't see it as a major contradiction, but it is there in one portion of his thinking. So I leave you here with this presentation of Dalit thought in late colonial Tamilnadu. And thanks very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you the wonderful world of Ayodhya's and other Dalit thinkers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. You explained very delightfully and justified the topic of this webinar. Now, may I requested to all the participants, please unmute your mic and ask the question or type the question on chat box.
Shubhangi,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Dr. Thorat will speak for 10 minutes as a chairman. You request Dr.
Yes.
Thorat. Dr. Thorat
Okay.
will be there. Yeah.
Okay.
He will comments. Yes, sir.
May I requested Honorable Sukhadeo Thorat sir for his presidential remark. So,
well, I am very sorry that I am not able to join you directly because I'm running a flu. But I listened to the entire lecture by Geetha. Good evening, Geetha.
Hi, very nice to see you. It's been so long.
Yeah, it's so long.
Yeah.
But what a fantastic lecture, Geetha.
Thank you.
Such a big canvas to interpret the British period and the interaction of Dalit and the activism of Dalit during the British period is a difficult thing, but you have really unfolded many of those complicated things. But above all, I think the most important thing is about Ayodhya. I am feel frustrated and sad that we do not know much about him. People beyond Madras do not know about Ayodhya much. And from your description, we understand that how insightful author he was, and how he brought a different perspective on the tracing the relation of Dalit to Buddhism. I don't want to make many points, but I think at least one point I would like to make is that the association of Dr. Ambedkar with P. Narasu is known to everybody. That he picked up that book, Essence of Buddhism, and brought out a second edition and also wrote a foreword to that, because he was so much influenced by a book by P. Narasu. But I think the writing of Ayodhya Das is in a similar vein, and how he relates the connection between Dalit and the Buddhist, and linking the present, you may call former untouchable or Dalit, with Buddhism, their tradition, is a very important point, which is made emphatically by Dr. Ambedkar. He relates. I think his theory of who were untouchable, the book, who were the untouchable. The central point in that book is that untouchable were the Buddhist. And because they opposed Brahmanism so vehemently, untouchability was imposed on them. So one of the reasons, besides they continued to be the beef eater, but important reason was that they were Buddhists and they were against Brahmanism. And Brahmanism has never spared those who oppose Brahmanism. I think this is, and I have a feeling that some of this point Dr. Ambedkar draw from Ayodhya Das and from P. Narasu, the point that he mentioned later on. And Dr. Ambedkar has a very close connection with Madras. He went to Madras several times. N. Sivaraj is, of course, the very prominent leader of his party. But this is a very great tradition that you really brought out of Ayodhya Das and the whole struggle. Especially, the migrant going out and coming back, and some of them starting. I got very new idea from you that this reformer from Punjab, I forgot his name, that he was the party of Gadar party member. Manguram, yes. Many members of the Gadar party went to USA. Lala Lajpat Rai met Dr. Ambedkar in Colombia there. And Lala Lajpat Rai, I think, stayed there for 4 years or so. In fact, I read that when Dr. Ambedkar was awarded a Dalit degree by Columbia University, and the person who was made in charge of Dr. Ambedkar to take him around was some gentleman called Das, and he was a member of Gadar party. So, but I think it is a very, very insightful understanding that you have brought on the anti-caste movement and Dalit thought in Tamil Nadu, particularly Ayodhya Das, and we would like to have more discussion on him. Maybe we will request you later just to have his thought on how Dalit were Buddhists and then his variations. Thinking about it. Well, thank you very much. I think I should leave now the floor open to the answers and questions. There may be many more clarification to be sought here. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Thorat. Thank you very much. I
Thank
just
you so
wanted to add one thing to what you said. When
Yes.
Ambedkar comes to Tamil Nadu in the 40s, when he's Sivaraj actually takes him to into places where there is the people who had converted during Ayodhya Das's time are still around. So Ambedkar, and Ambedkar actually says, I met these Buddhists who converted some decades before, and while their numbers have not grown, they are still there practicing Buddhism. So Sivaraj obviously means those who converted from the time of Ayodhya Das and who continue to remain Buddhists.
Oh, I see. I see. Are there societies, Buddhist societies of that?
In fact, from that time onwards, Tamil Dalits have remained Buddhists in places where they converted in the early 20th century. So you have, and again, it's a very interesting connection with labor. In KGF, for example, the Kolar gold fields, where many Tamil migrants went to work on the gold mines, there's still a continue there. You have those Dalit Buddhist institutions there still, viharas, libraries, and so on from that time. You also have them in other parts of Karnataka, Hubli, for example, Bangalore, and some of them actually try to keep it alive in their migrant spaces in South Africa, for example.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's another story. We'll come to it some other time.
Maybe some other time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Hajare, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam.
Uh,
Thank you for your wonderful presentations, madam. It's a really wonderful. You have taken a big round around the Tamil Nadu from your colonial period, educations, occupations, mobility, options, choice, and gift of Western education. To each of rituals have a Buddhist origin. Very nice presentations you have given. Now, Shubhangi.
yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. May I requested all the participants, please unmute your mic and ask the question or type the question on chat box.
Yeah.
Or raise your hand.
I think Dr. Thangaraj is there.
Yeah.
Dr. Thangaraj.
Yes.
Dr. Thangaraj, please carry on. Yeah.
I think the speaker has presented her webinar very well.
Yes.
I enjoyed her presentation. Yet I have some 2-3 points to be clarified by the speaker. One is she was saying that the regiment, the Dalit regiment or Pariah regiment, a probe into the Pariah regiment shows that it did not continue till the end of the British period. British government had to abolish the Pariah regiment. I do not know whether my reading or understanding was correct or not. And closely, the other information that the regiment has helped the Dalit to enter into the Madras Legislative Council. You know, that any examples for that? And I have another information. Another point is that you were referring to Vibhuti Sangam and Dalit Sannyasis. So I want you to clarify these two also, Vibhuti Sangams and Dalit Sannyasis.
Okay, sir.
Should I answer right away? Should I answer right away as soon as?
Yeah. Please.
Yeah. No, of course, the Pariah regiment, just as a Maha regiment, was sort of discontinued after 1857, when the British had a new understanding of caste. They felt only some castes can be soldiers, and they identified Rajputs and Gurkhas and others as martial races, and they took them into the army. And we all know that for a long time in Maharashtra and here, there were protests in having the Dalits back into the army, and they were recruited again only during World War I. So yes, the regiment was disbanded and then brought back during World War I, and of course into World War II. Now the connection between Dalits being in the army and being in the legislature.
Ma'am, you're muted.
Mic mute. Your mic is mute, madam. Yeah, please.
No, I said that the Pariah regiment, of course, was disbanded like the Maha regiment was disbanded, because the British had come up with this new theory of the martial races, that they would henceforth only employ people who were naturally soldiers, like the Rajputs or the Sikhs or the Gurkhas. And the Mahars and the Pariahs were sent out of the army. And there's been a lot of, there's a long history of Dalits asking to be taken back into the army, particularly in Maharashtra. And any case, with World War I and World War II, they were brought back into the army, and that's another story. Ambedkar, in fact, as we know, wanted to write a history of the army. He never did, but he was very interested. He had collected notes on the history of the British Indian Army. The other thing is the connection between being in the army and being in the legislature. That's not a straightforward one. But those who were in the legislature actually speak of how being in the army has helped the Dalit community to access learning and education. You find all legislators and Dalit legislators in the assembly saying that on different occasions. That's interesting. About the Vibhuti Sangam was a caste Hindu organization. that was against conversion. And it set itself against Dalits being converted to other religions.
Alka Patil, please make your mic off.
So it was sort of formed to prevent conversion, but it also became a kind of a, let's say, an Orthodox Hindu organization, which also was associated with violence against Muslims and so on at that point in time. It also died a natural death after a while, the Vibhuti Sangam. Dalit sannyasis are very interesting because in the early modern period, you have a number of them active in public life. So I'll just mention three. One is Swami Sahaja, who was associated with the Chidambaram temple and who started a major school for Dalits there, which runs to this day. He was a part of the Indian National Congress, but interestingly, he took Ambedkar's side during the Pune Pact. So while he was in the Congress even, and he supported the demand for separate electorates and all of that, but he was a sannyasi, and a very, very interesting sannyasi at that. Then there was Swami Advaitananda, who was associated with many causes in Sri Lanka, in Ceylon, and who also wrote for the journal Adi Dravidan. Then there was Swami Desigananda, who worked a lot with Dalit laborers in North Madras. These are some three of the names that I know. But then there were other sannyasis who weren't active in public life, but who were seen as important sannyasi figures in Madras. And it is of these that the late G. Ramakrishnan had written about, and how their institutions actually were open to people from all castes, and even non-Dalits held them in high esteem because of their deep spiritual knowledge and power and so on. So that's to answer some of your questions.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much. Dhamma Sangini, next question. Please unmute your mic and ask the questions.
Hi, Dhamma Sangini. So nice you're here.
Yeah.
I'm listening to you.
So nice to have you here.
Yeah. माझा प्रश्न कोणी ट्रान्सलेशन करेल का?
Yes, you can ask. Yeah.
माझा प्रश्न असा होता की महाराष्ट्रामध्ये फुलेंच्या चळवळीनंतर जी ब्राह्मणेतर चळवळ आली, तिने ज्योतिबा फुलेंच्या विचारापासून डिपार्चर घेतलं आणि ती पॉलिटिकल बनली. तसं आयरीदासांच्या कल्चरल मुवमेंट नंतर उभे राहिलेले पेरियार यांनी त्यांच्या कल्चरल पॉलिटिक्स पासून डिपार्चर घेतलं की त्याचं डेव्हलपमेंट केलं, असा माझा प्रश्न आहे. कारण बुद्धिस्ट प्लॅटफॉर्मवरच पेरियार तयार झाले होते आयुदासांच्या, पण नंतर मग मला नाही वाटत की त्यांनी बौद्ध सांस्कृतिक राजकारणाला पुढे घेऊन गेले. तर त्याच्याबद्दल मला प्रश्न विचारायचा होता की आयुदासांच्या कल्चरल पॉलिटिक्स पासून किंवा भूमिकेपासून पेरियारांनी डिपार्चर घेतलं की त्याचं डेव्हलपमेंट केलं.
Okay.
Geetha
madam.
Hajare.
Yeah.
See, Geetha, you understand the question?
I think she wanted to know the difference between the cultural work that Ayotidas had done and what Periyar had done, right?
Correct. Yes.
Broadly,
yes.
I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But let me add. Also. You understand Marathi? It means.
Well, when I listen to it, something comes back. I've spent so much time in Maharashtra, no?
Yeah. She also saying is that the Jyotiba Phule's movement, the cultural aspect of it converted into more so in politics, and cultural aspect, that is anti-Brahminism and other things, sort of wither away. Does the same thing happen now with Ayotidas, that his cultural aspect of Ayotidas was not taken forward by Periyar, and only it reflects in the politics.
Right.
Non-Brahmin political power and
right.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's a great question, Dhammasangini. As always, pleasure listening to you. And it's a very interesting question because I think Ayotidas dies in 1914 and Periyar comes into public life in 1919. He's obviously aware of the kind of work that had been taking place around Ayotidas' magazine, Tamilan, because the magazine was sort of continued by others after his time. And Periyar was in touch with somebody who edited the magazine in the 1920s and 30s called Appadurayar. And he went to Kolar Goldfield several times, made speeches, and Periyar's journals advertised all the publications of the Buddhists from KGF. And Tamilan also carried notices about Periyar's movement. But interestingly, what happens between 1914 and the 1920s is this, that Buddhism, which is sort of seen by Ayodhitas as the basis of Indian civilization itself, and that unless one becomes a Buddhist, one cannot really have an equal and fraternal society, that idea loses importance in the 1920s and 30s. And for lots of different reasons. I think one important reason is that if you look at it from a historical point of view, from the 1920s, you have a language of secular political rights taking over everywhere across India. And once that language becomes a dominant language, to oppose Brahmanism, you use the language of secular rights. While you criticize Brahmanism in cultural and religious terms, to oppose Brahmanism, you use the language of secular rights and justice. So either you say, let us oppose Brahmanism because it is cunning, because it is hegemonic, because it is against equality. Let us assert equality, let us assert our rights to justice and so on. So the language of secular rights takes over, and the language of Buddhism sort of goes into retreat. Buddhism is not the context from which you challenge Brahmanism. You challenge Brahmanism from the point of view of equality, fraternity, and liberty, but using an entirely secular register. And this is something that our young Dalit researcher Stalin Rajangam has pointed out in a number of his writings, that this passage from Buddhism to the language of secular rights is a very important thing for us to understand, because what that ends up doing is that the Buddhist communities founded during the early 19th century then function at two levels. In social and religious terms, they adhere to Buddhism, but in political terms, they use the language of rights. So the critique of Brahmanism becomes political, whereas the social and religious life remains Buddhist. So you don't have Buddhism as an overarching context. Now with Periyar, what you find is he criticizes Brahmanism on many grounds. One, he offers a rational critique of Brahmanism. He also offers a very in today's context you can say a hermeneutic critique of Brahmanism, that he the sort of deconstructs Brahminical literature, Brahminical custom, logic, all of that. He also has a secular critique saying that Brahmins cannot claim any privileges on the basis of birth. This is an age of equality and justice. He also says Brahmins are insufferably arrogant and that cannot be accepted in a democracy. So he, at many levels, he criticizes it. He also says that Brahmanism has become a worldview and even non-Brahmins are becoming victim to that worldview. So he has that critique as well. While he welcomes Buddhism and Islam, especially not Christianity so much, but Buddhism and Islam as alternatives to Brahmanical Hinduism, he does not make a case for conversion or for affirming that Buddhism is the original civilizational thing. He's too much of a product of modern secular thought to actually think that Buddhism has a future. Now, this is where, of course, Ambedkar is startling and interesting, because he actually thinks Buddhism can be the future. And in that sense, I think in Tamil Nadu, you don't have a continuity of what Ayodhidas did immediately in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But today, for example, in the wake of all that's been happening since the 1980s, you have a young generation of Dalits, especially, interested in Buddhism again. You even had sporadic conversions over the last few years. People, or rather, not conversion so much as accepting the Diksha. So it's interesting that that is happening. But Dhammasangani's question is very interesting, that, what happened to that cultural, spiritual critique of Brahmanism? That's split into two. So if you're a Buddhist, you remain a Buddhist in certain ways, but politically you side with the anti-Brahmin secular politics. So, and of course that means that you can also take the part of other secular politics, right? You can be in the Communist Party, or you can be in even the Congress for that matter. So Buddhism doesn't find a political form. So we can put it that way.
Okay,
I hope I've answered your question, Dhamma.
Yeah, thank you, madam. Now I will, Nagorao Savle, come forward and ask your question. Nagorao Savle. unmute your mic.
Yes. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yeah,
you are.
Yeah. So thank you very much, ma'am. You have very gracefully unfolded the layers of this Dalit movement and anti-caste movement in post-colonial era in Tamil. I am basically a mechanical engineer, and it was a very insightful for me.
Nagaraj, there is some sound from your side.
Yeah.
Am I
Now it's
audible
clear.
now?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, you are audible.
Yeah. Actually, I am not at home. I am outside.
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
attending while on job.
Okay.
So thank you very much, ma'am. As I said, I'm a mechanical engineer, and this was very insightful this session was very insightful for me. New information was there in this. My question, I have two questions. Number one is, we have seen many similarities on untouchability subject or point of Periyar Ramaswamy and Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar. But I came to know, ma'am, correct me if I'm wrong, I read somewhere that constitution has been burned by Periyar Ramaswamy. So is that right? And what was the reason for that? So this was my first question. And second, in Tamil Nadu, nowadays, in past few years, we are seeing that, at least in Maharashtrian people who knows Dalit history very well and read about the histories, that the Tollywood cinemas, like movies Jai Bhim and the movie Kala, and one more movie I think P. Ganawal director has directed, are putting the point very, very aptly in front of the world audience of Dalit history and how they have fought. The movie, the subject is not only the showing the tyranny, but how well they fought. This is very, very, very insightful and very amazing. So, is this the movement is gaining the momentum in last few years in Tamil Nadu, especially in Tollywood? So, I hope my questions is clear.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. Yes, Periyar and Baba Sahib shared a great many things in common. But Periyar was actually very critical of the Constituent Assembly proceedings. And if you recall, Baba Sahib himself did not expect much from the Constituent Assembly. If you go by all the speeches he makes from 1939 to 1945. But as you know, whenever history offered a chance, Baba Sahib never failed to make full use of that opportunity, because he felt that he had to do that for his people. He often said that. So he goes to the Constituent Assembly and he accepts the role assigned to him. Periyar's point was that the Constitution has not outlawed caste. It has declared untouchability to be abolished, but it has not said that the caste system should be considered illegal. And therefore, he felt that that was a major limitation in the Constitution. And he also felt that the right given to people to worship and to practice religions of their own choice would someday lead to them justifying even practices like untouchability, saying it's part of my religion. Oh. So he had this sort of critique of the Constitution. He didn't burn the Constitution, he burnt sections of the Constitution which affirmed the right of people to actually practice things that could be inimical to other people. So that's an important difference that we need to keep in mind. He didn't burn the Constitution as such. But Periyar, we must understand, unlike Baba Sahib, was not a state builder. In fact, he could be described even mildly as an anarchist. He was both welcoming and suspicious of state power always. He felt that the state should support demands that are righteous and just, but he didn't think that the state as an institution can be a model for actually bringing in progressive change, because he felt that that kind of political power can also lead to corruption. So, but that's a different argument. We won't get into that right now. So that's also an important difference between Baba Sahib and Periyar. The thing about this new cinema in Tamil Nadu, it's interesting. I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of intellectual and cultural activity that has emerged from Dalit constituencies since the 1990s. And initially we saw it in literature, we saw it in publishing. and in music with the great Ilayaraja, who, as some of you might know this, he's also from the
Yes.
Dalit community. So you have that sort of voice coming in different ways. But I think what you find today is people who, like say Ranjit, who's been making these films, he is in his 40s, right? Or late 30s, 39. So this is a generation that came of age after 91, after the centenary celebrations of Baba Sahib Ambedkar's birthday. And that period witnessed a lot of cultural, very rich cultural stuff happening all over Tamil Nadu. In fact, you had something called the Dalit Arts Festival that used to be held night after night and year after year in Madurai city. This was organized by the Tamil Nadu Theological Seminary, which had a Dalit resource center. This is a connection between conversion, Christianity, and Dalits. And that went on for 10 years. And that was fascinating because that was when you could have a space where Dalit performers, Dalit arts, anti-caste, theater, there was room for all of that. Earlier, only the communists would do these cultural festivals. But now you had a space for Dalits to come and do this. And soon that became a kind of a shared space. Not only Dalits, but anyone who wanted to do something in a spirit of anti-Brahmanism or anti-caste were invited to those spaces. So you have that history. And so today's generation of young filmmakers like say Ranjit or Mari Selvaraj and others have sort of grown up in that atmosphere. And there's a very rich history waiting to be written of what different Dalit communities have done across Tamil Nadu by way of protest cultures, by way of, challenging caste and so on. So today, if you have Ranjit and Selvaraj and others making these films, it's because they are, their voice, they're fearless, they want to say these things. And you also have a generation of young Dalits and non-Dalits who are committed to anti-caste politics, who are a ready audience for these films, right? There is also that. So I think all of these things have come together to make that possible. And also, I think the way these films both work with standard Collywood ideas, but also subvert them. And that's very interesting, which is what you see Ranjit doing with, with actually getting Rajinikanth to act and using Rajinikanth to convey an anti-caste message. So some very interesting developments are taking place.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. T.S. More, please unmute your mic and ask your questions. Dr. T.S. More, please.
Yes, sir. Sir, am I audible, sir?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, please.
Madam, it is a very enlightening talk. I have to raise 2 points only. Has the anti-caste elite intellectual in Tamil Nadu provided any framework for free India? Got my point?
I'm sorry, your voice was breaking up.
Yes. I am repeating again. Has the anti-caste intellectual elite of Tamil Nadu provided any framework for free India? Followed?
Yes.
You got my
Yes. It provided any framework for free India. Yeah.
yes. Yeah. The next one. What was their perspective towards Indian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a very
Got the
interesting
point?
question. Yeah. So,
Okay, please.
if you look at the self-respect movement and the Dravidar Kazhagam that Periyar founded in 1944, so the self-respect movement was an anti-Brahmanical movement and an anti-caste movement, which was founded in the 1920s by Periyar and others, and it continued well into the 30s and 40s. And throughout that period, they offered a very sustained critique of the Indian National Congress and of Gandhi. And they supported Baba Sahib Ambedkar during the Pune Pact talks before and after. They kept up a relentless critique of Gandhiism throughout that period. And in fact, they also wrote a lot about exactly like what Baba Sahib says and what Congress and Gandhi did to the untouchables. At one level, all of that was happening. But they were also very critical of nationalism as such. not simply the Congress party and how it understood the nationalist question, but they were critical of nationalism as such. And Periyar in the 1940s, especially 30s and 40s, in fact said that we must not settle for a narrow nationalism. We ought to really be thinking of a culture of internationalism where we are all citizens of the world. And he felt that narrow nationalism sort of prevented you from examining the hierarchies and injustices in your own society, because you kept saying that we are one nation and then you didn't look at all that could be wrong potentially with that nation. So this is something that he kept in focus almost through his entire life. Secondly, he felt that Indian nationalism was inexorably Brahmanical. He felt that it had built around the nation a religious aura, that if anybody were to say anything about that nation, that was considered sinful. So he says it's like all these mantras you chant. You keep chanting this stuff about the nation again and again, but you don't stop to ask yourself, what are you supporting? What are you endorsing? Is this a right thing or a wrong thing? So he felt nationalism had become a kind of religion. And mind you, he's not talking about the Hindu right. He's talking about nationalism per se. So he had this critique of nationalism being inexorably Hindu, that it was Brahmanical because it refused to sort of critically look at itself and just repeated itself over and over again to make it attractive to people. And it relied on what he considered non-rational elements. So he has this great critique of the Dandi Satyagraha, where he says, how was the Dandi Satyagraha communicated to the public? Gandhi was made out to be like Sri Rama, and all his followers were made out to be like the people who supported Sri Rama on his exit from Ayodhya and into the forest. So he says, you bring back religion, you bring back these Puranas, and then you sort of merge that with the nation, and that's not going to make for a healthy, self-respecting society. So he was critical of nationalism throughout his life. And towards the 1940s, when the Pakistan demand was getting very strong, he felt that perhaps the Madras presidency should secede from the rest of India and form a Dravidian nation all by itself. But he refused to define the Dravidian nation in terms of language or culture. He said the Dravidian nation would essentially be a place where there will be no caste. He defined it as a casteless society. In fact, when Baba Saheb met him in the 1940s during his visits to Madras, there is a reference in the Tamil press that Baba Saheb jokingly told Periyar, if that's going to be Dravidistan, I don't mind being part of it. I don't want to be part of this India that is Brahmanical. So, but what then happened is, of course, the Dravidian national project took a life of its own. Whatever Periyar understood by Dravida Nadu or Dravidistan was very different from how parties that emerged out of the Periyar movement understood it. So while it was still seen as something that wanted a more federal India, wanted a more non-religious India and all of that, it accepted the idea of nationalism. So that's where we are, where Tamil Nadu is concerned today.
Yeah, thank you, madam. Bharti.
Yeah, hi.
Yes.
Hi, Bharti.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Yeah, so it's as usual a wonderful lecture, and again, a great introduction to Pandit Ayodhya sir. I have a few questions. Number one, so regarding the revisionist position in academia regarding caste and colonialism, that we have to understand caste with respect to colonialism rather than they sort of exonerate the entire pre-colonial or pre-modern era, right? So I mean, how do we understand that? That's the first question. And number two, Buddhism as a European religion, and you have mentioned this in other talks also and in your essays also. But Buddhism as such, with the neologism of ism, Buddhism, it's again a European discovery or invention is what is claimed by the European Orientalists. And how did Ayodhyadas navigate the blatant Europeanism and found an entirely Tamil understanding of it? And another question that raises is the notion of conversion. You've touched upon it very beautifully, how there is no notion of conversion rather than returning to the roots. But there are certain Hello.
गोंदिया जिल्ह्यामधील आमगाव इथे 4 वर्षाच्या मुलीवर 17 वर्षीय अल्पवयीन मुलांना अत्याचार.
Somebody is talking. Can you please unmute yourself and let Bharti finish his question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think.
Yeah.
Okay, the post muted everyone. So yeah, another question is regarding conversion. Conversion as such is a very personal and political process. In Tamil magazine also we can see Ayodhyadas giving tips and to many distressed souls, and if you find any interesting incident of that, I want you to narrate. Ma'am, mute. Ma'am, unmute.
Ma'am, please unmute your mic.
So there has been this, since the late 1990s, there has been writing on caste, which suggests that there was greater fluidity in pre-modern India, that castes were not so fixed in terms of occupation or in terms of identities, and that it is the British who came with these ideas of, each caste is sort of a substantial entity on its own, that, that it can't be anything else. And through the census, they fixed caste identities. Now, obviously, that argument was strongly made 10 years ago, and it led to this understanding that the British actually created the caste system. And before that, it was far more fluid and so on and so forth. Now, I think what's important to remember is that, yes, of course, the British came and asked people to participate in the census. They also sent their own administrators to identify how do the Indians think of themselves, what is this caste system all about, and so on. But I think Indians were equally dynamic. They were also sort of looking around them and asking questions about who am I and what am I. So if you look at the Tamil context, for example, why is it important for Rettamalai Srinivasan, R. Srinivasan, to say that I am a pariah, right? And I think the reason is that he wants to also say that in this modern age, how does it matter who I am? I am as important, as equal as any other human being. So I will not be ashamed of using the word pariah. So while on the one hand, the colonial census is asking people whether you're Dalit or whether you're this or whether you're that, those that are there in the marginal sections of society are also redefining their own identities. And I think that's interesting, because while Rettamalai Srinivasan says, I'm a pariah, Ayodhyadas says, I don't want to call any of you pariah, you're all Buddhists. So even amongst Dalits, there's no singular opinion on how you should define yourself. So I think if you only look at what the government was doing, you get this sense that the government had put certain categories into place. Everybody had to fit themselves into that category. Perhaps it works to a certain extent in terms of access to government resources, in terms of how the government responds to what you're doing. But there are many other aspects to human existence. We just don't live in relation to the government. So how do I present myself to my fellow citizens? If you're going to call me pariah with a kind of an insulting manner, I'm going to get back and say, I'm proud to be a pariah. So, in that sense, caste becomes something else as well. So we need to really think of what was happening around caste in a very dynamic kind of way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about, there's also this thing, a lot of writing on Buddhism, which says that, all this stuff that people were writing about Buddhism, they actually were very, they were coming to Buddhism from their own understanding, these Western scholars of Buddhism, that Buddhism actually is part of a broad argument within what they term, Indian civilization. So you have Brahmanical Hinduism, you have the Jains, then you have various philosophies of Hinduism, and you have the Buddha and his thought. So they say that the Buddha perhaps did something that is not very different from what Martin Luther did to the Catholic Church. He questioned the worst aspect of Brahmanical Hinduism. So Buddhism is a kind of a reformist religion. And it is only by translating the various texts of the Buddha and putting them into one formal kind of a situation that we have created something called Buddhism. But Buddhism never existed on its own, that it was always fluid, it was moving in and out of Hinduism. This is an argument that some Western scholars have put forth. Now, for those in the late 19th century and early 20th century, what these scholars were saying was not as important as the fact that the recognition that Buddhism is a distinctive tradition in India. Whether it got accommodated within Brahmanical Hinduism, whether it remained distinctive always, that's not a question Ayotidas is interested in, or Bodhanand is interested in, or several others are interested in. What they are interested in saying is that if there was this distinctive tradition, what happened to it? And why can't we claim it as our own? Because that's what makes us alive to ourselves. See, what was important for Ayotidas was to say that if I say I'm a Buddhist, then I say that I have made civilization in the subcontinent. If I say I'm a Buddhist, I'm the one who's actually contributed to the arts of living, because I have actually been a peasant, I have been a trader, I have been many things, and I have valued all those things. Brahmanical Hinduism has come along and said, these are all bad things. Brahmanical Hinduism has said, you have to believe in God. Brahmanical Hinduism has said, you're only equal in a philosophical and spiritual sense, but not in a social sense. But if the Buddha has said all of this, then clearly that Buddha speaks to me. So I have every right to claim that Buddhism as my civilization. So I think Ayotidas and others, including Bodhanand and many others, do that from a very strong position of wanting to claim culture and history for themselves. And they are not doing this apologetically. They're not doing this in a kind of a confrontational sense. They are doing this in a deep cultural and religious sense as well. So, and I think that's something that we perhaps cannot understand today if you only look at what Western scholarship on Buddhism has to say. We have to look at vernacular scholarship on Buddhism as well, and that is very fascinating and very interesting and very rich. In fact, you find so many people talking about the Buddha, not just those who accept Buddhism, but even those who are not quite sure of whether Buddhism is, a reformist Hinduism, or whether they think Hinduism has swallowed Buddhism. Even they are asking questions about what was this thing about the Buddha? What is such a fascinating personality? And Professor Uma Chakravarti was recently saying that the Buddha is the only man in history, at least in ancient India, who attracted a charitra. You have the Buddha Charita. No one else attracted a charita. So he was also seen as a real historical being. And that made him very attractive. He had lived, he had worked, he had suffered. He had also presented a tradition of enlightenment. And I think for Ayotidas and others, that was very important, that the Buddha is someone that they can recognize as a human presence and not as a Puranic presence. So I think we need to understand that on the terms that Ayotidas and others were writing, rather than in terms of what scholarship on Buddhism has to say exclusively. That scholarship is interesting, it's important, but I think it doesn't let us understand what it was to be a Dalit, what it was to be someone in Ayotidas' time, or to be someone who found the Buddha fascinating. And I think that's important. The third thing, very interesting, one of the things that you have in Ayotidas' magazine, a lot of people write to him asking questions about what does it mean to be a Buddhist? I suffer in this manner, what do I do? And you have Ayotidas actually taking time to answer those questions. He answers those questions both as a Buddhist and as a healer, as a doctor. So and it's very interesting, because what would you say about those columns? Is he a counselor? Is he a psychologist? Is he a Buddhist? He combines all those roles, and he tells them how do you lead your life? How do you practice being a Buddhist? And that's quite interesting. There are lots of instances, Bharti. I can't recall anyone suddenly just now. Maybe we reserve that for another time.
Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Hajare.
Yeah.
I want to come here.
Yeah, please.
Geetha, I think these first two questions are significantly important. That is that the British, by conducting the caste survey, has specified caste. And some of those, the crazy academician also didn't go further and argue that the caste system was in a way created by the British and it is not an ancient institution. And you know that in the Indology departments in USA, some of them propagate this view to the foreigner. numerically examining caste, estimating caste, identifying their occupation and changes in the caste has also happened in medieval India and during, say, from 200 AD to 1200 AD. This is a period where there is a much larger transformation and changes in the caste system have come up. For example, Shudra in ancient India, R.S. Sharma, or Vivekananda Jha, who has brought out a recent book on Chandala. Now, Manu recognized only 4 castes. Manu doesn't recognize untouchable. Beyond the 4 castes, he does recognize outcasts, but doesn't. At that time, outcasts were not recognized as untouchable. So it is later that the untouchable class, according to many of the scholars now, was formed by outcaste, that is those beyond the 4 castes, and a division between the Shudra. The impure Shudra, the lower in hierarchy, they got merged with the outcast, and that constitute the untouchable class. And in one section of Shudra became a Shudra and got elevated. The Shudra didn't have a right to land and they were not involved in cultivation, but you find later on the Shudra being the peasant cultivator, that change in the Banusmriti. What I'm saying, that estimation of caste, their occupation and changes also has happened in medieval period and also some part of ancient period. But estimating, numbering, identifying their occupation and all that by British, why should it be called that they have created a caste, going almost close to the saying that they have created a caste? So there is a strategy and conspiracy on the part of Brahminical scholar in USA particularly, including the president of California University, Columbia professor, what is his name, Stern something? Yeah, that is one question. So that I just wanted to make 1 or 2 points. If you like, you can comment. The second question is, of course, is Buddhism is the original thought and contribution, or is it is an reformistic religious thought? Its intention was to bring a reform in the Brahminical order. I think not only the Western thinker, but I think most prominent thinker, two of the leading Hindu scholars, Radhakrishna and Vivekananda, who have said that Radhakrishna in that book, 2500 Years of Buddhism, in a forward mentioned that Buddhism was hearsay, that kind of opinion about Buddhism, and that it was a reformist movement. Same is the story with Vivekananda. I think Lalmani Joshi was a renowned scholar, died very young. He took this issue in a greater detail, and how Buddhism was an independent thought, although it grew in reaction to the Brahminism, but it is an independent thought and a philosophical stream and way of life that has been brought in. I don't have a time to go into greater detail, but that is what the argument is. But the point that I want to mention is this, that this has been a strategy of the Brahmanical Hinduism or Brahmanism to say that Buddhism is nothing but a sort of reformist movement, and then take away Buddhism into Hinduism, even going to the extent of calling it is the Vishnu, Avtara of Vishnu. So assimilation and accommodation has been the strategy used by the Brahmanism to kill Buddhism and to absorb it in Brahmanism. In fact, this has been accepted by Radhakrishna himself and Vivekananda himself, that Vivekananda used a very strong word that we have embraced the Buddhism and throw away the body and throw away the content and just keep the body. That is also the argument of Radhakrishna. So the strategy of assimilation and accommodation to retain Brahmanism, but assimilating, but at the same time not leaving the hardcore principle, the basic principle of Brahmanism. I think that is the strategy which is being used now here. Comparing Ambedkar with Hegdewar, comparing Buddha with other scholars. So that strategy of assimilation and accommodation is being used is revived now to a greater extent during the current period of counter-revolution, which Dr. Ambedkar would define as a counter-revolution. I think I don't want to take more time, but I think these are very important points. The person who has asked you a question and the clarification that you have given, I thought I should express a few points.
Absolutely, it's so important, especially at the present state, both in terms of scholarship and public thought, that there's a tendency to completely not accept that Buddhism has this distinctive philosophical and spiritual tradition, and that it challenges Brahmanism. And it's being said over and over again. Yeah, no, it's very important to understand it's not simply Western Orientalism, but a steady tradition of Brahmanical scholars also who've done this.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam. Now, next questions. Only 3 questions are remain there and not more questions. We will take it because time is going out. Mr. Praveen, please unmute your mic and ask your questions. Mr. Praveen.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. 1 second.
Please.
Ma'am, thank you for the lecture. Ma'am, I want to ask you a couple of questions. One is, what is the Theosophical Society's take on Buddhism? Because Theosophical Society considered spirituality and gods to be in the same realm. Did it consider Buddha to be a god, or did it consider Buddha to be a historical character? One is this. Second is, what is Theosophical Society's engagement with caste? This is second. And the third is, when Shyam Prasad Mukherjee was a member of the Theosophical Society, how did he make this transition to the Hindu right, particularly the Janasangh? So these are the 3 questions, ma'am. Thank you.
The Theosophical Society is a very interesting institution. I think one of the reasons why it initially, in its initial days, it gave it up later, brought in the question of Buddhism itself as a kind of a world religion that would stand in for different streams of spiritual thought, was largely on account of Colonel Olcott's personal interest in Buddhism at one level. At another level, when it became very clear that to project Buddhism as something that held the potential to be a world tradition of spirituality, came into contention in the Madras presidency. Olcott beat a retreat, and he sort of moved away from that very expansive conception of Buddhism to see it as one tradition of Indian spiritual life. And while he didn't assimilate it to Brahmanism as such, he did sort of, let's say, fudge the differences between it being a historical development and it being a metaphysical domain. So Buddha in some ways became a kind of Mahatma, and they had this tradition of Theosophical Mahatmas, these superior beings who had lived and departed from this earth, but with whom you can be in touch and receive spiritual guidance from, and so on and so forth. So there was that attempt to render the Buddha a kind of Mahatma, and also to go back to what Bharati had said, to sort of domesticate the Buddha and make him to be a kind of reformist. So you have Olcott's catechism, Buddhist catechism, which is actually suspiciously like a Protestant conduct book. So it's very, very interesting how the Theosophical Society shifted its positions around Buddhism quite a bit. And as for its position on caste, to be fair to Colonel Olcott, he was very concerned about the persistence of untouchability in the so-called modern period. And under his, when he was president of the Theosophical Society, he started the series of what were known as Pariah schools. And some of the schools function to this day. And he was very warm and open to Ayodhitas and his constituency of Dalit Buddhists discussing matters of caste and metaphysics with him. So he, in an ameliorative sense, he did that. Now, he was also very close to Anagarika Dhammapala, the great Buddhist scholar from Ceylon. And Dhammapala was interesting because he set up the Mahabodhi Society and he wanted to recover the Bodh Gaya temple for Buddhism. And but he also realized that if he had to do that in the Indian context, he cannot make enemies of the Hindus. He needed them on his side. So he also sort of tried to do this balancing act between Brahmanism and Buddhism and trying to not pit them against each other all the time. And I think he and Olcott were similar in their understanding of caste, therefore, that they agreed it was a terrible thing, but they were not sure how far and how intense they wished to go with their critique of caste. And I think Dhammapala was fairly, let's say, politically astute. So when Ambedkar announced that he was going to convert, and he was going to leave behind Hinduism, the Mahabodhi Society journal actually, not during that, during the Pune Pact, 1930, when Ambedkar sort of made this claim for separate electorates, you find that the Mahabodhi Society journal carries a number of articles on how cruel caste is. But that's not consistently done in the journal. And I think Anagarika Dhammapala's attitude was also the attitude of the Theosophical Society, but the society gave up writing about caste after Annie Besant became the director. She in fact supported Brahmanical Hinduism to the hilt. She felt that Brahmins were superior human beings and they were fit to be supermen and all of that. So it's a very, very, very mixed kind of history that the Theosophical Society has with respect to Buddhism and caste. In fact, the only Buddhist director of the society was a Ceylonese, Jina Rajadasa. Everyone else before, either they were Westerners like Olcott and Annie Besant, or they were Tamil and Telugu Brahmins. Shyam Prasad Mukherjee was a president of the Mahabodhi Society when he was still a politician and social activist in Kolkata. And let's not forget that the Hindu Mahasabha had a kind of a very interesting take on Buddhism. And like Professor Thorat was saying, there was always an attempt to position the Buddha as a kind of a Hindu reformist and someone we should embrace. And it was not very difficult for those who were associated with the Hindu Mahasabha, which Mukherjee was, to also make forays into the Mahabodhi Society. So rather than him moving to the Hindu right as a break from what he was, perhaps we should see the accommodation of Buddha and Buddhism within the broad spectrum of what they held to be Hindu civilization, the Hindu Mahasabha in particular. So these are some things that we need to look at in detail and carefully.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much. Now, Nagarav Savle, you will take your second questions if time permits. Now, I will take Dhammachari Deepan Kumar. Dhammachari Deepan Kumar, please ask your question. Unmute your mic. Yes, Dhammachari Deepan Kumar. Can you hear me? Deepan Kumar ji. Deepan Kumar ji. Hello. Unmute your mic.
I think he's having trouble connecting.
Yeah. Now, Nagarav ji, ask your second question, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
In short, please.
Yeah, in short only. Ma'am, I came to know during your discourse, you said Indra is another name of Buddha. Is that right?
That's what Ayodhya says.
Okay. And I came to, ma'am, during my reading that Ayodhya, the current Ayodhya was earlier Saket, ancient Saket, the name of that Ayodhya. And also the character Yudhishthira in Mahabharata is inspired by Samrat Ashok, Emperor Ashok. So can you just throw some light on this?
I wouldn't know about Yudhishthira and Ashoka, but Saket is definitely part of the Buddha's universe. And the Buddha was a great walker, as you know. He walked the length and breadth of the Gangetic plains, and he does pass through Saket several times. And you know that that was very central to some of the early conversions that happened. So that's certainly a Buddhist landscape. Now, the question of whether Yudhishthira is modeled along Ashoka, it's very complicated because I think there was a simultaneity of philosophical traditions. You had Brahmanism, you had Buddhism, you had Ajivikas, you had the Jains, and I think there was a great deal of borrowing back and forth everywhere. While the Buddha was very distinctive in what he said and what he proclaimed to the world, subsequently in the post-Buddhist period, there was a lot of fluidity. So it's possible that that certain later additions to the Mahabharata redesigned Yudhishthira's character, so he perhaps took on some of the attributes of the Emperor Ashoka. I wouldn't know. I don't know enough about that, but it's possible.
Okay, thank you. Deepan Kumar.
Hello, can I audible?
Yes? Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you, madam. You have given very valued and worth talks. Hello.
Yes,
hello.
I can hear you.
Yes. Please go on. Carry on.
My question is that In India, we are having more than 32 to 35 crores Dalits. In spite of that, we are not going to follow the Buddhism. Why? What is the reason? Because all educated mass also, they are not going to follow this Buddhism. Because Baba Sahib has told Buddhism is the only religion to change the world. Then why the people are hesitating? Why they are not going to embrace this Buddhism? Why they are not going to follow this Buddhism? It is my question, BT. Is
I'm
it
gonna,
you
I'm gonna,
just highlight highlight this question, sir.
I'm going to actually ask you a question because one of the, and that's a classic Buddhist way, right? To answer a question with a question. You know, go back to Baba Sahib Ambedkar's very important speech in Dadar, right?
Yeah.
What path to salvation? What path to emancipation? What does the last part of that speech say? He says, I'm not going to ask that all of you become Buddhist because I want you to become Buddhist. And he quotes from what the Buddha says to Ananda, right? Be a lamp unto yourself.
Yeah.
Doesn't he say that? And it is that whole Attadipa, right? Each of us has to be a lamp. It's a frightening thought because you have to be completely responsible for whatever decisions you make. You can't blame your birth. You can't blame fate. You're alone with your reasoning, and you need to sort of work with that continuously all the time. Isn't that frightening for a lot of people? And I think that is why you need a kind of a vinaya for everyday life.
Yes.
Vinaya for the monks is one thing, but sadly Ambedkar did not live long enough to leave us a vinaya. He started, but he left us very soon. And so some of us are inspired and want to be Buddhist. Some of us don't want to be anything, but we are inspired by Ambedkar. But I think what is at stake is a vinaya for everyday living, which is a very important aspect of Buddhist ethics. And I think communities have developed that in Maharashtra and elsewhere. But it has not become something that everyone feels is something that is for them as well, right? And I think it takes a lot of courage to be a Buddhist.
Okay. Thank you, madam. Thank you. Over to Shubhangi now. Shubhangi. Conclude the program. Yes, we will not take more questions.
Dr. Hajare, just one small.
Yeah. Please, sir.
Geetha, I think Mahabodhi Society magazine was also the first journal which carried the critiques of Buddha and his Dhamma by somebody we don't know.
Yeah, it was. It was a very mixed thing, the Mahabodhi Society. It ran for a very long time. And there were many different views that were presented in it. Yeah.
Shubhangi,
yes.
to you. Yeah, please.
Without wasting any time, we will turn to this vote of thanks. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Pawan Khadse, student of Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai, for vote of thanks.
Shubhangi.
Mr.
to
Pawan.
one and all.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah. You are audible.
Thank you. Jebim to one and all. I'm Pawan Khadse and presenting vote of thanks. I hope you all have enjoyed the session organized by Association for Social and Economic Equality webinar on the topic Dalit Thoughts and Anti-Caste Movement in Late Colonial Tamilnadu. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the respected chief guest of this webinar, Padamshree Professor Sukhadeo Thorat sir, former chairperson of UGC and ICSSR New Delhi, and the president of ASEE, Association for Social and Economic Equality. On behalf of all the members, I express my gratitude to him. Thank you very much, sir, for your presence, guidance, and expressing your valuable comments. Today's guest speaker, Honorable Dr.V.Geetha ma'am, a feminist, historian, writer, and translator, also editorial director at Tara Books, Chennai. In her talk on Dalit thoughts and anti-caste movement in late colonial Tamil Nadu, she talks of a perspective offered by anti-caste and anti-Brahminical movements. She also highlighted the situation of the Dalits and the differences that army services broad on some level. She also talked of mass conversion into Christianity of Dalits and the possibilities of getting education and not being discriminated. She also highlighted the intensity of caste discrimination, as in how Savarna peoples didn't join the hospital sector as a nurse in the hospital because they had to touch the Dalit patients. Also, she explained that the expansion of prints and the Dalits in journalism entered, and how their perspective spread over the Tamil Nadu. She, ma'am, also threw light on the works of Ayuthi Das, and she also explained how he aligned the Buddhist philosophy with Western learnings. She also talked of healing tradition, how Ayuthi Das wanted to reinvent Buddhism through the Adi Veda. She also pointed out that how narratives of Mahatma Phule and the Ayuthi Das were similar to each other. Then thank you for your satisfactory answers to the questions raised by the participants, and thank you so much, ma'am, for introducing us to the Ayuthi Das and his works with Buddhism. On behalf of the association, I thank you so much, Dr.V.Geetha, ma'am, for your insightful, informative, and wonderful talk. I also express my gratitude to Professor Vimal Thorat, ma'am, Dr. Trilok Hajare, sir, Dr. Gautam Kamble, sir, Professor Vidya Chourpagar, ma'am, Dr. M. Thangaraj, Dr. Nagdeve, Mrs. Sura Darapuri, Dr. N.C. Mesra, Dr. Dange, Dr. Vijay Khare, Mrs. Vishakha Kamble, Mrs. Ranju Anitya, Dr. Sujoy Ghoshal, and the many more members of the association who have contributed to make this event successful. I would like to thank to all the members, participants for their presence and enthusiastic participation, and for their questions to make this session more engaging. Thank you each and every member of the for their cooperation and making this event or session successful. Thank you so much, everyone. Jai Bhim.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Jai Bhim.
Thank you so much, sir. Great thank you to everyone. We appreciate you being here. Thank you again